sincere one. In short, any representation made by a faithful human creature of that face and figure which he saw with his eyes, and which I can never see with mine, is now valuable to me and much better than none at all. I told you this is very wordy. Often I have found a portrait superior in real instruction to half a dozen written biographies. I have found that the portrait was as a small lighted candle by which the biographies could for the first time be read, and some human interpretation be made of them. On the question of portraiture in the Middle Ages, a good deal of ink has been used and more spilt, and it is commonly denied that there was any serious attempt at portraiture, let alone any genuine portraits, in Northern Europe before the opening of the 16th century. Exception might be made in favour of a few works by Jan van Eyck and Becket, but it is usual to regard effigies of stone, marble or bronze, and figures in stained glass or in the margins of manuscripts, as being no more than lay figures, accoutred in the dress of their time and bearing, coat, armour of their house. It is unfortunate that this dogmatic, negative attitude should have received such wide circulation, for it has hindered the proper understanding of medieval history by its support of the view that such understanding is impossible. Yet it is some 30 years since Letherby went straight to the root of the matter when he wrote that to say that a likeness was not intended seems against both reason and record. The National Portrait Gallery, in bringing together electrotypes from the royal effigies, as well as a collection of early painted portraits, has performed an extremely valuable service, for the original effigies can seldom be studied with any comfort, if at all. Using the gallery's collection as a basis, He was accustomed to settle questions of disputed charters where forgery was suspected. By personal examination, dubious cases that came before his judiciaries were referred to his more acute judgment. His memory was exceptional. He never failed to recognise a man he had once seen, nor to remember anything which might be of use. More deeply learned than any king of his time in the Western world, he was appealed to from all quarters. The summit of his power was reached in 1175, when he was called in as arbitrator between Toulouse and Aragon. And in 1177, when at a council held in London, he determined the ancient quarrel between Alfonso IX of Castile and Sancho VI of Navarre. That he was thus able to supplant the court of Rome in international affairs is indeed an extraordinary tribute to his personality and his justice. Map tells us that his mother taught him to prolong everybody's affairs and keep men dangling in hope while he filled his own purse, and that in respect to cases in his court which went on so that many die before they get their matters settled, or leave the court driven by hunger. He followed this maternal counsel only too well. Yet Map's own statement that whoever has a good case is anxious to try it before him, whoever has a bad one will not come to him unless he is dragged, must be placed on the other side. As to another of his failings, Map is inconsistent, for he accuses Henry of shutting himself up away from honest men, accessible only to the unworthy, yet goes on to say that whenever the king went out, he was seized upon by the crowds and buffeted hither and thither, even assaulted with shouts and rough pullings and pushings, in spite of which he never complained or showed anger, but listened to every man patiently, and if mishandled beyond bearing, retreated to some place out of reach. The story of one of his judgments needs to be told in full, as Map tells it. It was the custom of our court that sealed briefs containing their names and duties were drawn up and delivered to the ministers of the court gratis. Now the king's dispenser laid an information against a sealer that he had refused to deliver him a brief containing his name and duties without payment. Turstan Fitzsimon was the dispenser, Adam of Yarmouth the sealer. The court, after hearing them, was in doubt, and called in the king. He first heard Turstan, and then Adam, who said, I had received some guests, and I sent a man to beg the Lord Turstan to give me 2 cakes of your own royal sort. He answered, No. Afterwards, when he wanted his brief, I remembered that no, and in like manner I said no. The king decided against him, who had said no first. He made Adam sit at the bench with the seal and Turstan's brief placed before him, and he compelled Turstan to put off his mantle, and on bended knee present Adam with 2 royal cakes, decently wrapped in a white napkin, and when the present had been received, ordered Adam to deliver him the brief, and so reconciled them. And Cistercian house, which should of course have most rigidly debarred such excesses. But even then, Cistercian austerity was greatly relaxed, though within a few years of the death of St. Bernard, for the monks had their own private toasts of Brill and Vril, answering the washeal and the drinkale of the lay banqueter. Into all this the abbot initiated his guest. Later on, the abbot visited court, and as he reached the presence, was greeted with Brill by the king, who made him perform the whole ritual of the toast, to the amusement of everybody but the unfortunate ecclesiastic himself. Henry's respect for the cloth was not exaggerated. In 1157, long before the great quarrel with Becket over the rights of the church, Bishop Hilary of Chichester, whose jurisdiction over the abbots of Battle was on trial, objected that the secular authority could not deal with a spiritual jurisdiction or depose any bishop or other ecclesiastic without leave from the Pope. The king's reply was, "True enough, he cannot be deposed, but he can be quite shoved out with a push like this, suiting the action to the word." While attending church services, the king used to spend his time doodling or sketching or in whispered conversation, but he was not indifferent to the sanctity of such a man as Hugh of Avalon. One brother, Gerard, was once taking Henry to task for his sins, while Prior Hugh waited silently with his head bowed. Taking no notice of the monk, the king turned to Hugh and asked what he was thinking of. "Are you making ready to leave our kingdom?" Hugh answered gently that he did not despair of the king, but was rather sorry for the troubles and labours which hindered the care of his soul. "You are busy now, but some day, when the Lord helps, we will finish the good work begun." At this the king burst into tears and embraced Hugh, swearing that he should not depart from the kingdom while he lived. "With you I will hold wise counsel, and with you I will take heed for my soul." Hugh once excommunicated one of Henry's foresters, and was summoned to the royal presence at Woodstock, where he found Henry and his courtiers sitting on the grass in a circle. The king took no notice of Hugh's greeting, but remained in a sulky silence. Hugh pushed aside an earl and sat down. At the king's side, Henry, too, restless to stay quiet, called for needle and thread and began to stitch a leather finger stole which he was wearing on his left hand. After a minute Hugh said, "How like you are now to your cousins of Falaise," alluding to William the Bastard's mother. That's William the Conqueror, the tanner's daughter. Overcome by the joke and the prior's sly impudence, the king rocked with laughter and then explained the allusion to those who had not grasped it. Not only could Henry take a joke in good part, he could also show remarkable delicacy. Map tells how he was ruling at the head of a body of knights and clerks, talking with a distinguished monk, Tom Rerick. There was a high wind at the time, and just as the cavalcade appeared, a white monk was walking along the street, looking round, and tried to get out of the way. He dashed his foot against a stone, and as angels were not bearing him up at the moment, fell in front of the king's horse, the wind blowing his habit right over his was his grasp and through to the beggar. Green remarked that Becket was not abreast of the highest level of thought of his own time. When Hugh of Avalon, as Bishop of Lincoln, forbade his archdeacons and their officials to take fines instead of inflicting penance, they defended themselves on the ground that the blessed martyr Thomas had done the same. Believe me, said Hugh, not for that was he a saint. He showed other marks of holiness. By another title he won the martyr's palm. In almsgiving also it is easy to see an element of vain glory in Becket's behaviour. Archbishop Theobald had doubled the amount of the regular archiepiscopal alms. Thomas on his accession doubled the amounts which had been given by Theobald. But when, the day after his consecration, some minstrels and jugglers who had performed before him when he was Chancellor came to him for their usual rewards, he refused them, saying that his possessions were a sacred trust from henceforward, not to be spent upon actors and jesters. Above all this there is a sad atmosphere of cant. The martyrdom of Thomas Becket was a martyrdom which he had repeatedly gone out of his way to seek, and while it is impossible to condone the savage folly of his murderers, one cannot but feel sympathy towards Henry, thus placed in a position of responsibility for the death of a man who in happier days had after all been his friend. Becket got what he asked for, but Henry, as generous and as just as he was free from petty spite, was left burdened with murder and sacrilege for the remaining 20 years of his life. It is a major irony of history that Becket should be regarded as a martyr for the cause of freedom from a state tyranny largely imaginary, and against which Henry and the like strong kings formed the greatest bulwark. The dubious character of church interference in policy did not escape Henry. When, in 1185, the Patriarch Heraclius visited him to launch a new crusade, Gerald the Welshman suggested that it was a great honour to the king that he should have been chosen out by the Patriarch above all. The kings of the earth, Henry retorted, the clergy may well call us to arms and peril, seeing they will take no blows in the fray, nor shoulder any burdens they can avoid. Even as regarded war against the infidel, the principle of pacifism was recognised, for Walter Map, writing of the Templars about 1186, says, "They take the sword and perish by the sword, but, say they, all laws and all codes permit the repelling of force by force." Yet he renounced that law, who, when Peter struck a blow, would not call out the legions of angels. It does seem as if these Templars had not chosen the better part, when we see that under their protection our boundaries in the Holy Land are always being narrowed, and those of our enemies enlarged. Gerald, some 15 years later, went further in accusing the Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, of correspondence with the enemy, France, of sending food to the enemy for his own personal gain, and of making a corner in the grain market. Moreover, knowing as well he might, since it was done by his advice, that owing to the war between the kings, an order had been issued that a search for arms should be made in England, he caused all arms that were anywhere for sale to be purchased, and collected a vast number in a very short time. Then, as soon as a further order was made that arms should be procured throughout the realm, he forthwith offered his store of arms for sale and made a vast profit. It is clear persecute